The estate loomed like a private city as the driver dropped her at the wrought iron gate, where the marble lions watched with cold patience. She adjusted the strap of her worn bag and gave her name to the guard, who glanced at the list as if it were scripture. The gate swung inward, and the long drive unfurled, a pale ribbon through manicured lawns, past cypress trees clipped into obedient spires and fountains that hurled perfect arcs into perfect ponds. She kept her gaze forward. The house rose in stages, terraces stacked atop columns, glass panels set like mirrors to the sky, a staircase spilling down the front like a white waterfall. She told herself it was just a job, not a judgment, not a test. Still, her hands kept finding each other, ringing. The air had that smell rich houses have: wax, cut grass, something expensive and floral that never exists in nature. Inside, the foyer hushed her steps. Light stabbed through the crystal chandelier in 1,000 obedient rays. Marble spread out in vain swirls, a cold ocean she was expected to swim. A woman in a pencil skirt, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes approached, a clipboard held like a shield. She introduced herself briskly, led the way down a corridor whose walls displayed giant black and white portraits of men shaking hands with presidents, and women in gowns framed by flashbulbs. She stopped at a closet already arranged with duplicate uniforms on labeled hangers, placed a stack of folded shirts into the maid's arms, recited the rules in a voice that sounded memorized. Maintain surfaces. Leave no trace. Never address the guests. Meals taken in the lower kitchen before noon, after which the upstairs staff is invisible. And the final instruction, delivered with a small pause: do not disturb the young master. A name was given, the family name that curled like a brand over everything in the house and beyond it. An empire built on steel, on shipping, on banks, depending on which article one read or which rumor one believed. The maid nodded. She understood invisible rules. She had lived by them for years. But on the way to the servants' hallway, a painting caught her eye. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, in a white shirt buttoned to the throat, was painted against a storm-blue backdrop. His lashes were long enough to cast shadows on his cheeks. His eyes, pale, drifted not toward the painter but somewhere else entirely. She felt a stir of something she couldn't name, and followed the supervisor's clicking heels. The lower kitchen had the softness of a place where relief hides: warm tiles, a kettle perpetually singing, the smell of onions surrendering in butter. 2 other maids looked up from polishing cutlery. One was older, wrists thin as reeds. The other was young with a half-moon scar near her ear that glinted when she turned. They offered shy nods, and the older one pressed a cup of tea into the newcomer's hands as though passing a secret. Names were exchanged, truncated by duty. The chef appeared long enough to point at charts on the wall where tasks marched in tidy lines: silverware rotation, linen carts, staircase assignments by day of the week, chandelier dusting every 3rd Wednesday with goat hair brushes. The supervisor returned just long enough to tap a manicured nail on a separate column drawn in red: no entry, east wing, 2nd floor, after 10 p.m. The maid glanced at the scarred girl, who simply lifted a shoulder and looked away. Work stitched itself into hours. The cloth in her hand learned the language of surfaces, the resistant tension of lacquered tables, the greasy ghost that glass leaves on fingertips, the faint grit that clings to marble like a memory. She liked the rhythm when it came, the focus that narrowed the world to a square foot, and the simple victory of making something gleam. The house breathed around her in a pattern: boots thudding in the service hall, a door sighing shut, a distant laugh that never turned into conversation. She learned the eyes of the cameras and the areas where they blinked slower. She learned which rugs swallowed noise, which stairs murmured beneath weight. She learned to step aside when Mrs. Dupont drifted past, pearls clicking, voice a blade wrapped in velvet. The matriarch never looked down, not even once, as if glances were coins and she never paid the poor. On the 3rd day, rain braided itself across the windows, and everything smelled faintly electrical. The supervisor's car failed to start, and for once the checklist was delivered without the metronome of heels. The maid carried fresh towels up the back staircase, balancing them like clouds. At the landing, a framed newspaper caught her attention, a headline about a new philanthropic initiative for vision research, a photograph of mother and son at a gala where the boy's hand rested on her arm like a taut pose. He wore dark glasses even indoors. The maid stared a second too long and almost missed the sound, the fragile tumble of wooden pieces hitting carpet. She stepped toward it before remembering the red column on the chart. The corridor here was softer, muffled by wool runner and silk curtains that drank the light. The door was half ajar. She did not mean to look. But the human ear is a disobedient creature. It had already walked into the room before she did. The soft scrape of puzzle pieces moving, the small breath a child makes when concentrating. She set the towels on a console and nudged the door with her knuckles, not enough to announce, just enough to confirm. The boy sat cross-legged on a Persian carpet, a wooden puzzle spilled before him, a map where continents were blocks, oceans were gaps. He wore a plain gray shirt, no shoes. Those famous glasses lay beside his knee, abandoned. His eyes, startlingly pale, were open. She had expected the unfocused glaze she had seen in the painting. Instead, he watched the puzzle in tiny rapt intervals, scanning edges, selecting a piece with a swift, confident pinch of fingers, sliding it into its notch with a rotating twist, not feeling his way but judging quietly, like a craftsman. The gear inside her chest shifted. She shouldn't be here. He was not supposed to be disturbed. Yet the room held her, a small gravity. There was a smear of paint on the boy's thumb, a dried blue half-moon. On the low table near him, a sketchbook lay open to a page where quick, sure lines had caught the way rain streaks through air. No sightless person drew rain like that, catching its slant and taper, its tendency to gather and break. The boy reached for the final piece without patting the carpet. He knew where it was. He lifted it, turned it until the country bordered its neighbors, pressed, and click, the world completed itself in his lap. His head tilted. "Someone's in the doorway," he said, not loudly, not timidly, just like stating an address. Her throat tightened. She considered retreat, but the towels she'd left on the hall console felt like flags marking her presence. She let the door open a little more, stepping so the hinge wouldn't whisper. "I'm sorry. I was delivering towels and I heard. I didn't mean to intrude." He didn't reach for the glasses. He looked at her the way birds look at a breeze, measuring. "Most people knock and then tell me I couldn't have heard it anyway." He lifted the puzzle by its frame and set it on the table. "They assume I live in sound." She knew the line she was supposed to parrot. "I can get someone for you, sir." She didn't. "You put the coast in upside down at first," she said quietly, eyes flicking to the puzzle where a peninsula jutted backward before he corrected it. "Then you turned it." He blinked. It was almost comical, the way surprise moved across his face, a quick opening of the eyes, a clearing. "You were watching. I was standing here." She forced herself not to apologize again. "I'm new. I don't know all the routes." A small smile tugged at one corner of his mouth, then vanished as quickly. He picked up the dark glasses, held them in his palm the way one holds a stone with history. "If my mother finds you here, she'll say you ignored protocol. I'll say I was delivering towels." She gestured toward the hallway. "Which is true?" "Yes." He slid the glasses on, and in that instant his face transformed. It was like watching a door close. Behind the lenses he became the porcelain boy from the painting, the emblem, the tragedy. His shoulders hitched up, a habit with 1,000 repetitions. "You can put them on the cabinet." She stepped closer to set the towels down, careful not to look directly at him now that the mask was in place. Her reflection floated faintly in the glass of a framed certificate on the wall, wavy around the edges by design. When she turned back, he was gazing at a fixed point over her left shoulder with uncanny accuracy. It was a perfect imitation, and something about that perfection chilled her more than the marble ever had. "Do you need anything else?" she asked. "I'm supposed to say no." He reached for the sketchbook and closed it, covering the rain. "So no." She nodded and withdrew. On the threshold, her shoe scuffed the rug just enough to shift a forgotten puzzle piece that had migrated under the chair. It came to rest in the open, a little island of pale wood. She didn't bend to pick it up. She didn't have to. He glanced down, an instinctive flick as quick as a heartbeat, and she felt the ground shift again. The glasses hid his eyes, but they could not cage reflex. Back in the corridor, air returned to her lungs as if she had been underwater. The towels were accounted for, the card awaited her next task, the checklist downstairs would not forgive delay. She moved. Dust is democratic, it settles on both cheap tables and priceless ones. She let the cloth walk in circles and ovals, lifting fingerprints, erasing the proof of existence they left behind. Her head, however, would not release the image of that final reflex, that quick, human glance. She had met many lies, little ones that saved face, big ones that bought time, but never a lie this elaborate, this fundamental. A life organized around it. A mother who spoke of courage into microphones while fastening a blindfold in private. The thought was so ugly she had to set it aside just to keep moving. The other maids felt the static in her. The younger one with the silver scar asked if she was all right, while they folded napkins into swans that would look spontaneous later. She said she was fine, because that was the currency here, fine, perfect, handled. In the late afternoon, the house hummed with preparations for a dinner that required orchids floating in bowls like small planets, candles measured to the same height, place cards hand-lettered by a calligrapher whose wrists were insured. She watched the staff align forks like soldiers. She watched a butler polish a wineglass until it held no evidence of air. She watched the matriarch descend, all gloss and calculation, with a gentle pressure in her hand on her son's elbow. The boy wore the glasses again. His expression was beautiful and remote. The guests tilted their heads with that mixture of pity and fascination people reserve for tragedies that will never touch them. The maid kept to the edges, obeying the choreography that had been drilled into her. Still, she could not unsee. Between courses she carried a tray past the long windows where rain still threaded down the glass, and she saw, reflected faintly, the boy's head turned to follow a waiter weaving deftly between chairs. Not the sound. No one hears a waiter's path in a room full of voices and silver. The line of his gaze tracked movement. The glasses hid nothing from those who knew where to look. After the final plates were cleared, the supervisor cornered her in the pantry with a thin smile and an index card of notes. Missed dust on the third finial of the west banister, a streak on the second-floor mirror that only shows at 4 p.m. light, a reminder about the east wing restriction. It was delivered as a kindness, which made it feel like indictment. She nodded and thanked her, and when the supervisor left she sagged briefly against the cool tile wall. She told herself to be wise. Rich houses love quiet help. Quiet help keeps its job, sends money, pays rent. Quiet help does not ask why a boy wears darkness in a house designed to worship light. Night fell like a velvet lid. The servants' stairs croaked underfoot in the way old wood confesses only to those who use it. In her small room off the laundry, the mattress sagged, but it was hers, and the blanket was heavy in a way that reassured her bones. She could have slept. She wanted to. Instead, rain tapped stories on the window, and her mind recited the day back to her like a litany, the sketchbook with the rain lines, the quick correction of the coast, the glance at the fleeing puzzle piece, the immaculate performance at dinner. She pressed her palms to her eyes until yellow sparks flowered there. If she were wise, she would treat what she'd seen like a dream, true while it lasted and gone now. If she were honest, she would admit that some truths refuse to dissolve just because they are inconvenient. She got up and made tea on the tiny electric coil, the mug chipped on one lip. Steam curled against the ceiling. The house above her creaked in the way all structures eventually do, no matter how much money girds them. In that domestic quiet she realized the word for what troubled her wasn't shock. It was grief, thin and surprising. She felt it for a life folded into a myth and pressed flat under glass. She felt it for a child who had been given the sky and taught to keep his eyes shut. Morning would demand motion and lists and an expression that revealed nothing. She knew how to wear such a face. But as she lay down again, the rain easing, a thought drew its own elegant line across her mind, sure as the stroke on the sketchbook page. Lies this large throw long shadows. And shadows only look harmless until someone brings a light. She closed her eyes on that stubborn flicker, not yet knowing it would demand to be fed, not yet knowing it would carry her to a door she had been warned never to open. Not yet knowing that the next time she heard the puzzle pieces, she would step fully into the room. Morning sun hit the glass facade like a stage light, splintering across the polished marble floors. The house stirred in its usual rhythm, staff whispering in the lower corridors, the clink of breakfast trays, the steady drip of a coffee machine that no servant dared let overflow. She fell into her work with the same practiced efficiency, but her eyes, her ears, her pulse, all were restless. The boy was everywhere and nowhere at once. She wiped mirrors and remembered the quickness with which his gaze had followed the puzzle piece. She polished silver and remembered the sketchbook with the rain drawn too accurately to come from touch. Each chore carried his image like a watermark that refused to fade. By mid-morning, Mrs. Dupont appeared in the grand dining room. She carried herself like a queen without a crown, the pearls at her throat glowing under the light. Behind her trailed a pair of advisors in tailored suits, their voices low, their eyes sharp. At the head of the table, Adrian sat stiffly, a plate of untouched fruit before him, the infamous glasses back in place. When one advisor joked about his keen ears, Mrs. Dupont laughed, loud and brittle, patting her son's hand as though to prove possession. He smiled the way a mask smiles, perfectly still except for the lips. The maid, arranging fresh flowers at the far end, noticed his shoulders flinch almost imperceptibly when his mother's hand lingered too long. The scene played like theater, the grieving mother, the tragic child, the sympathetic audience. And it gnawed at her. Every detail of his performance felt rehearsed, heavy, suffocating. Her cloth trembled against the vase. She excused herself before anyone noticed, retreating to the hallway where the air was thinner. Later that day, she carried linens up to the east wing. She knew the rules. But she also knew what she had seen. A plan stirred in her mind, not reckless but probing. If the truth was real, she needed more than suspicion. She needed proof. She waited until he was alone in the drawing room, seated in an armchair with a book splayed open across his lap. She cleared her throat softly as she entered, arms full of folded linen. He turned toward her, his eyes hidden but his body tense. "You dropped this," she murmured, letting a single spoon slip from the linen pile to the rug. But instead of letting it fall naturally, she angled it so it would land just beyond the chair's edge. It hit with a dull clatter, rolling in a small arc. He looked down. Just a flicker, but direct, precise. She saw it. The lie cracked again in front of her. He bent, caught himself, and stilled, the axe settling back into place. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She bent to retrieve the spoon, whispering, "You don't have to pretend with me." But his voice hardened, deeper than she expected. "Be careful." She straightened. "Why?" Before he could answer, a sound split the air. Mrs. Dupont's heels. The door burst open, and her sharp eyes narrowed on the scene. She spotted the spoon, the maid, the proximity to her son. Her lips curved in displeasure. "Is this what I pay you for? To linger in rooms where you don't belong?" The maid bowed her head quickly. "I dropped it, ma'am. It won't happen again." Mrs. Dupont's gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, as if weighing whether to cut her loose. Finally, she turned to her son. "Adrian, darling, don't let the staff distract you. You know how sensitive your nerves are." The boy said nothing. He sat as still as marble, glasses back in place, body locked tight. The matriarch swept out as quickly as she'd entered, leaving the scent of perfume and control in her wake. The maid stood frozen, heart still thundering. When they were alone again, Adrian spoke without looking at her. "You shouldn't test me. She notices everything." Her throat was dry. "I just wanted to know why." His jaw tightened. "Wanting to know can get you destroyed in this house." The words stayed with her for the rest of the day. She folded sheets, scrubbed stairs, polished the brass banister, but they repeated in her head like a mantra. Destroyed. Destroyed. Yet she couldn't let it go. The truth pressed at her ribs, urging her forward. That evening, while serving hors d'oeuvres to a cluster of guests in the salon, she saw it happen again. A champagne flute toppled from a tray, shards scattering across the floor. The guests gasped. Before anyone else reacted, Adrian turned sharply toward the sound, his head tracking the arc of glass as it slid. His mother's hand clamped down on his shoulder instantly, guiding his gaze away. "Don't startle him," she scolded the waiter, smoothing the narrative before it fractured. But the maid had seen it. Others must have seen it too, though they remained silent. She wondered how many had noticed over the years, how many had chosen to look away rather than risk the wrath of the woman who ruled this empire. When the guests departed, whispers lingered in the halls. A few servants exchanged glances with her, as if gauging whether she'd witnessed what they had. But no one spoke. Silence was the currency here, and everyone knew its value. That night, in the servants' quarters, she sat by the small window overlooking the gardens, the moon painting the hedges silver. She thought of the boy, locked inside an identity that wasn't his, forced to perform blindness so his mother could profit from pity. The injustice burned in her chest. She knew what it was to be unseen, to be judged before she spoke, to carry labels others forced on her. That was why she couldn't ignore this. Her chance came sooner than she expected. The next morning, she was assigned to polish the grand piano in the music room. Adrian was there, seated nearby, pretending to trace his fingers along the braille spine of a book. She took a breath and let the candlestick she'd been dusting slip. It struck the floor with a ringing clang. He flinched, head snapping not just toward the noise but directly to the shining brass that rolled under the piano. His eyes followed it until it stopped. She caught the movement, clear as lightning. This time she didn't pretend she hadn't noticed. She bent to pick it up, rose slowly, and let her gaze lock with his. "You saw it." For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then his lips pressed into a line, and his voice came out low, almost pleading. "Stop." But she stepped closer, whispering so only he could hear. "Why lie?" The question hung heavy between them. He opened his mouth, closed it again. His hands tightened on the book until his knuckles paled. Before he could answer, Mrs. Dupont appeared in the doorway again, her presence like a shadow cutting across light. Her eyes swept the room. "Is everything all right in here?" "Yes, Mother," Adrian replied quickly, slipping the mask back into place. "The maid dropped something. That's all." Mrs. Dupont's stare lingered on Amina, sharp as a blade. "Do not make mistakes in this house. Mistakes are not tolerated." The maid bowed her head, hiding the defiance building in her eyes. When the matriarch left, the boy whispered without turning his head. "You're going to get yourself hurt." She swallowed. "Maybe. But hiding like this, it's hurting you more." The words landed between them like a spark in dry grass. He said nothing, but his shoulders trembled, just once, before he stilled again. That night, she lay awake replaying the encounter. Every glance, every reflex, every moment confirmed what she already knew, Adrian could see. The lie was enormous, suffocating, and yet fragile. It could shatter with the smallest push. But pushing meant risk. Risking her job. Risking her safety. Risking his fragile trust. Still, as she stared at the cracked ceiling above her narrow bed, one thought would not leave her. Someone had to bring this secret into the light. And she was already in too deep to turn back. Rain returned like a secret being repeated across the roof, a soft drumming that made the corridors feel narrower and the walls lean in. She finished polishing the banister, the scent of lemon oil clinging to her sleeves, and listened to the house breathe, a door closing 2 halls away, the soft skid of slippers on stone, the distant hum of a vacuum swallowing dust and conversation. When the music room emptied, she slipped inside with a cloth she didn't need and a question she could no longer ignore. He was there at the window, the glasses on, the city smeared by water behind him. His hands toyed with a pencil, tapping without rhythm on the sill. She didn't announce herself. She picked up a stray sheet of staff paper left on the piano, set the cloth beside it, and asked softly, "Do you ever wish it would all just stop?" He didn't turn. "The rain?" "The performance." A long quiet expanded, full of things they had both refused to say. When he finally faced her, Some careful mechanism behind the glasses had stalled. Close the door. She did. The latch settled into place with a click too loud for such a small action. He slid the glasses down to the tip of his nose, as if the world needed only a partial view of his eyes to feel real. They were paler in the gray light, but alert, flecked with a color the house had trained him to pretend didn't exist. "You know," he said. "I saw," she answered. "Again and again. And I think you want someone to see." He held her gaze for a heartbeat, then looked away, into the rain-scored distance. "Knowing isn't the same as surviving it." "What is it, then?" She stepped closer, voice low. "A trap you can't name? A script you didn't write?" "That's pretty," he said, but there was no bite in it. "Pretty words don't pry open locks." "Then show me the lock." He studied her, as if weighing whether the relief of speaking would be worth the cost of being heard. Slowly, he took the glasses off and placed them on the piano lid like a relic laid to rest. It changed the room. The pretense lifted a fraction, and with it came a tremor of danger, like stepping past a velvet rope towards something guarded. "When I was born," he began, "the doctors were wrong. Or right at first and wrong later. It doesn't matter now which. My mother made it matter. She built walls around that story. Donors. Galas. Headlines. Every room in this house has a plaque on the other side of the wall that you can't see, thanking someone for believing the myth." He moved to the piano and sat. His fingers hovered above the keys, not touching, tracing the air the way a swimmer hovers before breaking the surface. "When shapes stopped being shadows and turned into things, I told her. I thought it'd make her happy." He let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "She cried and said I must never say it again. She told me I was confused. That I was imagining. That she would get me the best care so I wouldn't be frightened by these fantasies." The word hung there, ugly and familiar. She had heard men in suits use that tone when they were about to erase someone. "She needed me to be helpless," he said quietly. "Helpless was profitable. Helpless put us on magazine covers next to statistics about hope. Helpless bought warehouses and cut ribbons." He pressed one key soft. The note barely rose, then faded, like a bird reconsidering flight. "And then Helpless became the only safe place for me to stand. If anyone believed otherwise, she made sure they didn't. Tutors dismissed. Doctors replaced. Staff warned." Images bloomed in her mind, doors closing, signatures scratched under non-disclosure clauses, people ushered to the edge of the estate and asked not to come back. She felt the calculation of it like grit between molars. "What about you?" she asked. "What does a lie that big leave you?" "Inside it," he said. "With enough rooms to wander until you forget the way out." He turned the key again, and this time the note stayed. His other hand joined, a second tone leaning against the first, then a third, a fourth. A melody unfurled with a caution that belonged to someone who had always been watched. It was small at first, almost secret, but there was a clarity to it, a compass hidden in sound. She took a breath and realized she'd been holding it. "You taught yourself," she said. "Couldn't have a teacher," he answered, eyes on his hands. "A blind boy doesn't need to learn to read sheet music. He needs to be brave and inspirational and quiet." A thin smile touched his mouth. "I learned to play by watching fingers on videos at night. Learned to draw by watching tutorials with the sound off so the halls didn't tattle. Learned the house by the way light sits in rooms at different hours." He looked up. "You think I flinched earlier because I heard the candlestick. I flinched because brass shines differently when it rolls. You see it or you don't." The melody swelled, made of rain and resignation and something new that edged it from the inside. She could hear the shape of his life in it, each phrase taking one step further than permission allowed. When he stopped, the room felt too ordinary for a moment, like a theater after the curtain falls and the audience remembers their coats. "You could take this outside," she said. "You could take all of this outside." "And be what?" He looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "A scandal headline? A son who betrayed his mother for attention?" She has 1,000 ways to make me look ungrateful, unwell, unstable. All she has to do is say I'm confused again, and people will nod because it's easier than thinking they applauded a lie. That's what she counts on, she said. That people prefer comfort to truth. He let out a breath that shook. Truth is expensive in this house. So is silence. They stood at a crossing neither of them had named yet. Outside, the rain was easing, the drops thicker and slower, a storm tired of itself. Somewhere a clock ticked through its duty. She went to the book on the stand and flipped it open. The score on the page was blank. Not blank by design, blank because the music was all in his head. Let me help you, she said. His eyes flashed, not with relief but with the panic of a creature that has learned help has teeth. Help gets people hurt. You're not wrong. She made herself say it without flinching. But staying buried has been hurting you for years. She keeps you in a story because she doesn't trust who you'd be if you wrote your own. The only way out is to let someone else hear you say what you told me. He shook his head. Who would believe a maid over a philanthropist? She'll throw rocks made of reputation and I'll be the glass. Then we bring mirrors, she said. Make the light impossible to control. He almost smiled. Almost. You talk like an artist. I talk like someone who's been told what she is by people who never learned her name. On the far wall, a framed photograph showed him as a child on a dais, one hand lifted in a fragile wave while flashbulbs exploded. Her throat tightened. She thought of all the nights he had taught himself to turn pages silently. She thought of the sketchbook with the rain drawn right. She thought of him placing the glasses on the piano like a confession. What would it even look like? He asked finally, and the fact that he asked at all felt like a hinge shifting. How would we do it? You have a gala, she said, taste of the word bitter. A room full of cameras and people who believe they're immune to surprise. You don't need to accuse. You just need to be seen. A laugh startled out of him. That's the entire problem, isn't it? Then make it the solution. He stood. The movement was small but it sounded loud to her, like the first step on a bridge everyone said would collapse. If I stand there without the glasses, he murmured, testing the shape of the thought, they'll call it a stunt. If I track a falling object, they'll call it rehearsed. If I say the words, she'll say I'm ill. Then do all three, she said. And play. He blinked. Play? Play something you could not have learned in the dark. Play something that shows you haven't been living in the story she sells. Make the room hear the hours they refuse to imagine. He looked at the piano as if it had just introduced itself. The idea hovered above them, fragile and fierce. He could have swatted it away. He could have chosen the room he knew over the world he didn't. Instead, he touched the lid with his fingertips, reverent. Do you know what happens to people who contradict her? He asked, voice very quiet. I've seen what happens to people who obey her, she answered. He flinched like she'd struck him, not because she had but because the words landed where a bruise already lived. He nodded once, steadied by something that was not courage yet but its neighbor. If I do this, he said, you'll need to be careful. She almost laughed, not unkindly. I don't live in a world where careful is optional. He picked up the glasses and held them, turned them in his hands. It has to be clean, he said. No tantrum. No rage. No accusation she can call hysterical. Just light. A door at the end of the corridor opened and closed. Voices rounded a corner, then faded. He slid the glasses back on and the room dimmed again, but not all the way. The decision had let in a crack of brightness no lens could trap. Tomorrow, he said, more to himself than to her. Tomorrow night. She'll give a speech. She always does. She'll say I am her miracle. I'll be my own. Her throat burned. She hadn't expected to feel so much. She hadn't expected the relief to carry grief beside it. I'll be there, she said, steady. He nodded. If you see me hesitate, do something that makes hesitation impossible. How? He thought, then answered with a half-smile that made him look younger and more dangerous at once. You're good at dropping things. She almost smiled back. I'm excellent at it. They stood a moment longer, the strange quiet between conspirators who hadn't known they were capable of conspiracy. In the hallway, the supervisor's brisk steps approached, and in an instant the old staging returned. She lifted her cloth, he turned to the window, the house resumed its choreography. But under it, a counter-rhythm had begun, small and undeniable as a heartbeat in a wrist pressed to an ear. That night the rain stopped. The city below exhaled. The servants' quarters glowed with small lamps and smaller voices. She lay awake watching the pale stripe of moonlight crawl across the ceiling, listening to the house settling into its performance sleep. In the space between breaths, she saw the room full of people whose applause had always sounded like absolution to the woman in pearls. She saw the boy lifting his hands to the keys, eyes unhidden, shoulders squared in a posture learned alone. She saw glass falling, catching light. She saw heads turn. She saw the story crack. Morning would arrive like a test, and they would both take it. For now, she let her eyes close on the image of him in the glare, not an emblem, not a prop, not a miracle owned by anyone else, but a person making the mysterious, ordinary act of telling the truth with his body. The thought steadied her, sharp as a blade and warm as a cup held between two cold hands. When sleep finally came, it brought with it a single certainty that sang through every dream: the performance was ending, and the world was about to watch the curtain drop. The house transformed itself all day, like a stage learning its lines. Florists came and went with crates of orchids that looked too perfect to have ever grown in dirt. Electricians checked the uplights that would warm the marble to honey, making it appear less hard than it was. A string quartet rehearsed in the atrium, cautious at first, then more assured as the acoustics rewarded them. Staff moved in quiet circuits, carrying trays, unfurling linen, folding napkins into a shape that suggested ease. The supervisor's voice ticked through the lower halls, all measure and caution. In the middle of it all, she worked and watched and waited, each task a bead she threaded onto one long wire of intent. When the first cars glided up the circular drive and released their passengers onto the red carpet, she was stationed at the edge of the ballroom, silver tray at her hip, every nerve tuned. The guests arrived the way weather arrives, inevitable, loud, indifferent to the land they crossed. Rings flashed as hands were shaken. Laughter bounced off crystal. Photographers took their cues, choreographed to capture generosity at its most flattering angle. He appeared midway through the stream, guided by a butler who kept his touch light but firm, mother at his shoulder in a dress that shimmered like old money remembering itself. The glasses were in place. His mouth held the pleasant shape it had been trained to hold. Someone near the door whispered a compliment about resilience. Someone else asked for a photo with the brave young man. He stood straight and did not flinch when the flash went off, though she saw the swallow he had to force. Inside the ballroom, the light did its expensive work. Candles stitched a soft glow across faces, smoothing edges, erasing doubt. On the far side, a lacquered piano waited, lid lifted, keys gleaming like teeth. The podium faced it from an angle so cameras could catch both speaker and instrument in a single frame. She knew the choreography by now: welcome, mission, numbers, gratitude, a story about a miracle that fit neatly into the interval between cocktails and dessert. An orchestra of sincerity, conducted by a woman in pearls. She found her place along the wall and held very still, palms dry on the tray, eyes steady. He moved to his assigned chair left of the podium, a small pool of attention centered around him like a halo. The speech began as expected. The microphones loved her voice. It curled around the words hope and courage and tireless and legacy. Statistics paraded and bowed. The audience gave small hums of approval at the correct beats. When she thanked major donors by name, heads tilted with practiced modesty. Cameras raised and recorded. A reporter near the aisle scribbled notes with a pen that clicked, clicked, clicked. And now, the woman said, hand extended in the direction of her son as if presenting a saint's relic. A brief word from the bravest person I know. Despite his blindness, he has taught me more about vision than any boardroom ever did. Adrian, darling. Silence opened, the kind that anticipates two things at once and will accept either. He stood. The glasses caught the light and gave nothing back. His steps to the microphone were measured, neither hesitant nor eager, exact in the way of a person who has practiced walking under observation. He looked past the audience toward the dark beyond the lights, face composed. The room held its breath. "Thank you," he said, voice clear, softer than his mother's but carrying as if it understood rooms. "My mother is right about one thing. I have lived with a story for a very long time." A ripple moved through the audience, the kind caused by a shift too small to name. She felt it in her fingers and anchored the tray against her hip. From the corner of her eye, she watched the woman tilt her head in indulgent maternal attention, a hand at her throat that showed the pearls to best effect. He went on. "What we tell about ourselves shapes what we are allowed to be. If the story is a lie, it becomes a cage. If it is true, it becomes a door." He paused, and in that space the room leaned forward. Somewhere glass chinked, someone stifled a cough. He lifted his hands to his face. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, he removed the glasses. The change was small and complete. Eyes that had been hidden flooded with light. They were pale and alive and aimed, not in the washed drift people expected, but with the focus of a person choosing where to look. The nearest tables showed the first shock, like a hush that starts local and spreads. A guest's lips parted. A stemless glass halted midway to a mouth. The reporter's pen froze mid-stroke. She watched the moment land, a stone thrown into a lake whose surface had never been disturbed in public. He didn't drop the glasses or hold them up like an indictment. He set them gently on the podium and stepped away, turning toward the piano. His mother took a half-step forward as if to cut him off, then stopped, smile cementing, eyes warning. He sat at the bench and placed his fingers above the keys, not on them. For an instant he was a statue of contradiction, a boy the world had been told could not see, now about to do something that only seeing had taught him. The camera shutters began, first one, then many, like rain gathering. She didn't wait for his hesitation to bloom. At the edge of the dance floor, she pivoted, let the tray tilt, and released 3 crystal flutes in a controlled fall. They cascaded to the floor, arcing through light, catching it, throwing it. The sound of their breaking was clean and bright and inescapable. His head snapped toward them. Not a flinch, not a guess. He tracked the last flute in its final spin and met her eyes across the room, saw her, not as a sound but as a person. Gasps spooled from table to table. A guest said, "My God!" The reporter's pen resumed moving in frantic strokes. The woman's hand at her throat clenched hard enough to blanch the knuckles. He turned back to the keyboard and, with no flourish, began to play. The first notes were simple. Then the melody unfolded itself the way a secret does when it has finally found permission. It wasn't a showpiece you could fake by rote memorization. It was new, nimble, certain. It moved with the logic of someone who had watched light all his life and taught his fingers to tell the truth about it. The room altered as he played, all its surfaces now instruments. The chandeliers chimed under the higher runs. The low end shook the cutlery just enough to make it hum. Conversations died mid-syllable. Even the cameras forgot to click for a bar or two as if their operators had been converted from gatherers of image to listeners. He took them somewhere they didn't have a name for and then brought them back. When the last chord settled, no one seemed to know what the appropriate noise was. Applause began as reflex stopped, then came again, uneven, then cresting, then full. He stood, not bowing, not asking, simply breathing in a room that finally had to see him. He looked to the side. She saw the fear still living in the set of his shoulders, but standing beside it now was a shape that might have been relief. His mother moved first. She approached with the serene authority of someone who has never yielded ground without taking 2 territories in return. She kissed his temple, turned him gently toward the audience, and slid an arm around him so that any camera would frame them together. "What a remarkable display of perception," she said into a microphone she did not need. "When you live in darkness, your other senses blossom. My son is an example of what support can do." He took a step away from her arm. "No," he said, not loud but not soft. He faced the room directly. I am an example of what happens when a lie is given a microphone. I can see. There it was, the single sentence that changed the architecture of the evening, the season, the history of the glossy newsletter they tucked into donor gift bags. It was so plain that it punctured any attempt at spin. A murmur rose, less a sound than a physical sensation, the guests shifting in their seats, adjusting posture, recalibrating their faces. The reporter stood without realizing it, hungry for air from a higher elevation. The woman tried to speak and found for the first time that words did not come when called. She recovered with a brittle laugh. Anxiety can make anyone say things. He lifted a hand. Not to silence her, but to direct attention beyond both of them. Ask me questions, he said to the room. Throw something. I'll catch it. Turn the lights off and on. I'll tell you when you do. Bring me a score. I'll sight read. His gaze cut through to the tech booth. Dim the lights. Someone, compelled by muscle memory if nothing else, obeyed. The chandeliers drifted down to a hush. He pointed without hesitation to the emergency exit sign glowing red behind the last row. That one's flickering, he said, and a cluster of guests twisted to see it misbehave exactly on cue. Laughter burst out, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that announces a world just tilted. Questions came like startled birds. What color is her dress? He named it, not generic, but precise, wine dark with a bruise of blue in the folds. How many steps to the dais? He counted them with his feet, no stumble. Which donor is waving? He lifted a hand and answered by name, making the man drop his arm with a guilty start. Then someone from the press, voice steady with the thrill of a story cracking open, asked the only question that mattered. How long? He looked down at the glasses on the podium. His fingers brushed them once as if he were blessing a body before burial. Years, he said. Most of my life. The sound that moved through the ballroom then was not quite a collective gasp and not yet a verdict. It was a reckoning trying to recognize itself. The woman stepped forward, voice sharpening. We will address this privately. There are complexities you could not possibly. He faced her. The room saw him do it, and quieted, grateful for a script at last even if it had never been written. The only complexity, he said, is who owns the story of my body. It isn't you. Security did not rush in. Lawyers did not materialize. Something more ordinary and more dangerous happened. Witnesses became brave in groups. A former tutor in the third row, who had been invited as a courtesy he hadn't expected to accept, stood and said gently that he, too, had noticed things years ago and been dismissed. A nurse on the catering staff, borrowed from a temp agency, lifted her chin and said she had been told on her first day not to bring anything into the East Wing that could roll. A junior manager from the foundation muttered, Jesus, and dragged a palm down his face, suddenly aware of the weight of certain memos. The reporter wrote faster, then stopped writing so he could listen and remember. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Her work was done. She stood on the edge of the room, invisible by design, and watched him stand visible by choice. His mouth trembled once, as if the past surged up and tried to reclaim him, then steadied. He turned from the podium without waiting for permission and walked to the piano one more time. He sat and played not a proof now, but something like a benediction, spare, luminous, a melody shaped like a door opening. People cried, but quietly, as if not to scare it away. When he finished, applause rose like weather, untidy, unavoidable, honest. He stood without bowing and left the bench. The woman didn't reach for him. Perhaps she could not calculate the gesture that would restore an empire that had just unmapped itself. He found her in the crowd with ease. She was exactly where she had promised she would be, spine straight, tray empty, eyes bright. He crossed to her not like a supplicant returning to a sanctuary, but like a person walking toward the life that had finally come to meet him halfway. Thank you, he said, the words raw, simple. She shook her head. You did it. Would you? He faltered, then smiled at his own nerves. Walk with me. They left through the side hall meant for staff, a corridor where the paint was newer and the frames cheap and the air smelled of bleach and citrus. The noise of the ballroom thinned. Outside, the night was clean. The city glowed below, less like a prize than a map. Somewhere behind them, cameras still sought angles. Somewhere ahead, meetings would be called and statements drafted. Those currents would come. For a moment, they were only two people at the edge of a lawn, listening to wind comb the cypress. He touched the glasses in his pocket once, then took his hand away as if from a hot stove. "I don't know what tomorrow is," he said. "Tomorrow is the first day no one decides for you what you can see," she answered. He closed his eyes, opened them again, and did the smallest, bravest thing. He looked at the stars, at the head shaped like a wave, at the valet jogging toward a car with an umbrella, at the world that had been there all along waiting for its name to be spoken. The house behind them murmured with the work of dismantling a myth. He breathed in, long and steady, and the exhale was the sound of a story ending without regret. When he spoke, it was not to the cameras or the donors or the woman whose empire had depended on his darkness. It was to the night itself, a vow so plain it could not be misunderstood. "I see," he said. And the life ahead of him, hearing that, finally stepped into view.